Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this interview, which is about the current situation of our country. First, I would like to introduce our resource person, Mr. Travis Gomez, who is an associate director at Uzabaze, Sri Lanka, and he is also a visiting lecturer for the undergraduate programs for the University of London, conducted by the Royal Institute, Colombo, and he also lectures for ACCA and CFA at Icon Business School. Mr. Travis holds a director position at the CFA Society in Sri Lanka. Hi, Mr. Travis. Thank you for giving us your valuable time and accepting our invitation. We have few questions lined up for you today. So can we proceed?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first question will be, Sri Lanka had graduated to an upper middle income country in 2019. And now we have been downgraded to a lower middle income country with an inflation rate of 60.8%. Based on your opinion, do you think we will reach the middle income status anytime soon? What are your thoughts on this, and what factors do you see as the leading cause for this situation?
So if we take a step back, when we say about when we think about what makes a country middle income, there are variety of factors that go into it. So it's not. So I think one criteria that they use in terms of that specific measure is that they look at the income of the GDP per capita of a country, and that's one criteria that they're using to sort of signify what is that economic prosperity. However, I would say there are like other areas that you should also consider, in terms of like the health, the education levels of the country, the various other sort of aspects. So, I mean, I think when it comes to Sri Lanka, I think on certain aspects, I think we are far ahead, even for, if you compare within that middle income category, when it comes to things like education or things like healthcare standards. If you look at those key indicators about the health levels, the education levels, we are fairly at a good state in that. I mean, there's always room for improvement, but relative to other countries in our similar position, we are in a fairly good or in a better position there. And also, I think when it comes to things like, even when it comes to like economic prosperity, when you look at things like one way we can look at this is in terms of like the material goods, how that has sort of improved. So in terms of whether say how many households have access to electricity, to running water, to how many people are able to afford a vehicle, how many have access to the internet, to mobile phones. And we've seen a significant improvement in Sri Lanka since the 70s. So there has so on those aspects there has been improvement. But I think one area where we need to improve on is the economic resilience, which is really, I think, one reason why we have fallen back in those classifications about in terms of our middle income status, is because the underlying economic the resilience of the economy has been weak because of some structural issues. I think you all know in Sri Lanka we are currently in this situation. Because of there are some structural issues that has sort of led to this moment. So I think your question was on like the inflation being at this current level. So I mean, if you look at like the reasons that have contributed to that, so one has been, of course, the one key reason for this has been like the excess money printing that has been going on, and the reason for that is the underlying cause of that is some policy missteps that have happened. So one thing that happened was the tax cuts that took place in 2019 that basically reduced the capacity of the government to be able to fund its various activities, the various government budget expenses. So that means that has forced them to go for more borrowings as well as for more money printing. So that has been one sort of primary driver of this higher inflation. The other aspect is, some of the policy missteps, for instance, with the fertilizer issue, by outright banning of fertilizer at once without like having a proper plan in place to replace them. That has caused issues in terms of like delays for the farmers to get fertilizer, and that has led to those delays in terms of the harvesting cycles, which has led to some shortages. And that again, those supply issues are then again contributing to that inflation. And of course, the other issue, and the other issue, of course, is on the external side of things. So because of the current external debt situation that we have, there is a severe pressure on our currency, and a lot of pressure on our reserves to be depleting. So as a result, the government's measures they have taken is these very strict capital controls on even being able to even to like import even like medicines and uh, like very essential items. Even those have been very restricted. So again, those shortages are also contributing to the higher inflation. And I mean, apart from that, there's also just generally there's also been the external impact that is coming due to the high oil prices and the higher inflation. That is something that is happening globally. But I think we here in Sri Lanka particularly are feeling it particularly badly because of these other structural factors that has contributed to that. Yeah.
So we'll move on to the next question. Due to the economic crisis, all the major economic sectors that contribute to the national income are facing a massive decline in output and disruption in operations. How do you see this as a threat to our long-term and short-term economic growth? Do you expect any structural changes to this?
Yeah, so if you take, for instance, in the short term, I think we can look at this from like different perspectives. So one is if you take from the consumption, the household side of things, of course, there is there's a there's a significant pressure on that household's income. There are some households, maybe they might have lost their jobs, or they may be not getting the same level of business activity that they did earlier. So because of that, there is the household budgets are really getting squeezed, and as well as with a lot of these essential items, price increases as well as increases in the fuel cost, the electricity cost. That's again adding to this burden. So which means that I think one thing we're going to see is there's going to be a very significant slowdown, and we've already seen that in consumption. So definitely consumption is going to slow down a lot, and a lot of businesses that depend on that is going to feel that pinch. Then on the business side of things, again, the business are going to directly be affected because of the slowdown in consumption. The other aspect is on the investment side. So given the higher, so one measure that has been taken to curb the high inflation has been to raise those interest rates quite significantly. So partly it's due to the inflation, as well as due to global factors like the U.S. Federal Reserve also having raised their interest rates. We also need to respond in order to like defend the currency as well. So again, those higher interest rates means that there are higher borrowing costs, and that's going to affect businesses' capacity and their willingness to go for these investments. So again, on that front, we are in the short term, it's unlikely to see any businesses sort of going for any investments. So therefore, it's not really going to expand the capacity of the economy. So in the short term, I think those are some of the things we're going to see happening. In the more longer term, we need to be mindful of that, because of the situation, that it doesn't have these long-term effects, which can add to the structural pressures. So one long-term effect would be, if you don't address it properly, is that, people who have lost their jobs, or, they're not seeing the same, they're not in the getting the same business that they used to. In the long term, we can end up with a situation where, the amount of discouraged workers could be higher, where people, they've stopped looking for a job, or they've like lost some of the skills that they had. So they may not be able to re-enter the workforce, or to get them back, they're going to need to go through some of the skills and training. So that's one long-term effect that we need to be mindful of um, on the household side. Yeah, and the other is in terms of like business activity in general. Because if we don't make these investments, if we don't make these changes, these investments, then again, it's going to, our capacity to get out of this situation is also going to be limited. Because, one reason we are in this crisis as well is that our exports have not been diversified enough, over time. Still we are, when you talk about exports in Sri Lanka, you still like think about like tea and like garments and things like that, but it has not diversified beyond to like newer sectors. And particularly since, and in the past, we were very heavily reliant on like remittances from foreign workers. But now that is becoming less and less a source of funding for us, of foreign exchange for us. And again, the tourism situation is also being challenged. So because of that, we need to see, in the long term, we need to see what are the business active, what are the industries where we can focus on, which can, help to like diversify the economy. So again, that helps with making the economy more resilient. So yeah, so those are some of the measures we need to take.
Okay. So moving on, what is your point of view regarding the current political turmoil? In your opinion, what are the long-term and short-term political strategies that can be taken to overcome these circumstances?
Yeah, so I think when we look at the political situation that has happened, and the recent developments that have been happening since the start of this year, a lot of those protests and the agitation, I mean, a lot of it has been a direct response to the economic situation. So it's really the economic crisis has like boiled over into this political crisis. A lot of the protest movements and things were fueled due to, real, so it was both due to like political issues in terms of uh, uh, you know, uh, concerns about like corruption and lack of transparency. But also it was driven by like economic factors, like with the extended electricity cuts, the lack of fuel. So all of those had sort of boiled over into this political crisis. So really, in that situation, so given that, I think one thing that is important is that we need to address, if you have to move forward from this, we need to address some of those issues that were brought up, as a result of these protest movements and all, because at the same time, while we need like political stability, we also, what is also more important is to ensure that rule of law, and that some of these concerns are being addressed, because you need the support of the people's mandate, for even for the political system to go ahead. So what I mean by that is, like, if you look at other countries that have kind of gone through this similar sort of crisis situation. So this is a study I come across where countries in that went through during that Asian financial crisis in the 90s, countries which sort of had a more sort of authoritarian system, a very one-party rule system, they tended to experience, their crisis tended to be prolonged for a longer period. They had higher levels of inflation. It took them longer for the country to recover. Countries which were more, where there was a lack of um, accountability, those countries tended to struggle more compared to countries which had like good rule of law. They had like multi-party democracies. They tended to, even though there were like, they also do have issues and takes time. In general, what they found is that because you have that more transparent, more environment of greater transparency, greater accountability, that also has helped. Helped the the politicians to like enact some of the key reforms that were needed to help get out of this situation. Because if you have the public support, some of these like reform measures that you need to push through, like reforming the state-owned enterprises, making the public services more efficient, cutting back on some of those unnecessary expenses. You can get the public support to back you on those things. So I think when it comes to the political situation, I think that's also something to be mindful of, that the rule of law is adhered to, and that steps are taken to address those the concerns that have been raised by the general public.
Question. The central bank has intervened in the foreign exchange market to control the devaluation of the currency and impose more capital controls on the economy to stabilize the situation. What do you think are the other measures they can take in these situations?
Yeah, and just relating to the previous question as well, I think the central bank is also one aspect that we need to look into specifically. Some of the structural reforms we need to do around it. So one is to ensure that that independence of the central bank. Because I think one reason we have also got into this situation is because of the lack of independence of the central bank, which has led to this excessive money printing and has kind of contributed to this situation. So I think that's definitely one aspect. That's one of the structural reforms we need to look at. But apart from that, in terms of the measures that the government, the central bank can take. So already, I think they've done. They've already used a lot of their monetary policy tools that they have in terms of raising the interest rates, to going for some of these capital controls, making it very extremely challenging for like foreign currency to leave the country. It's even like very difficult to like even make like if you have like a payment you have to make for like a professional qualification or for education fees. So one is that very strict sort of capital controls has been one thing they've done. The other thing is in terms of another thing they can potentially do is to so already one thing they're already doing with the banks as well is that what they call this moral suasion. They're basically like trying to convince the banks to adhere to to maintain the currency within that managed float, within that the band that the central bank has given, as well as try to cut down on some of the black market activity and to prevent those leakages of foreign currency that is taking place. So yeah, I would say, I mean, they've already done a lot of those measures. But having done these measures, though, I think one thing we need to be mindful of is that particularly when it comes to these capital controls, we also need to be mindful of the impact this would have in terms of us being able to attract foreign investments. Because if for a foreign investor to come and invest, if they're seeing that okay, it's very difficult to like after you invest the money, if they're not sure whether they can get their money back, they can like repatriate their the returns from that. They're not, that's not going to give them a lot of confidence to come and invest. So while some of these measures have been taken because of the emergency situation that happened in terms of the current crisis, it's a bit something they need to be concerned of is that not to prolong this and that this does not become the norm, because that's going to affect us. Because and the other aspect it also affects is that even when it comes to imports, some of these imports are consumption related, and these very high levels of imports has contributed to the current crisis. Like in terms of like if you look in terms of like the high volume of like vehicle imports, that has been like a contributor to some of these balance of payment crises in the past. But at the same time, though, we are also, given the nature of our exports industry, we are also very dependent on like imports, because some of those imports are necessary inputs for some of the exports that we're doing, in terms of the garments, those fabrics and the various, there are different inputs that we need for that. So we need to be mindful of that aspect as well.
Okay. The next question will be, what are the other countries that have faced a similar situation as the crisis in Sri Lanka? What can be our learnings from that? Can Sri Lanka follow any similar methods as theirs to handle this situation?
So I mean, right now, what we are also now looking at is we are trying to enter into this IMF program, which Sri Lanka has done several times as well. So based on some of the studies that have been done on this, countries that have gone for these IMF programs since the 1990s, countries that have gone for these programs, typically what they find is that it takes about 2 years to sort of like at least 2 years to get out of the situation in terms of like inflation falling back to what it was before, the economy starting to recover. We are looking at least like a 2 year period for, once an IMF program is in place. So really one key contributor to that, apart from like the reform measures and things like that that happen, as well as any funding that is provided, I think the main reason, like the main benefit of having being part of the IMF program is that it gives confidence, it gives stability to the investors. It gives some credibility that in the country, and that will help to like stabilize the currency. That the pressure on the currency to depreciate might lessen. It might be able to attract more investments into the country as well. So that is one key reason for how so in general these IMF programs have been effective in terms of like stabilizing a country. So I mean, so looking at like the experience of like countries that have gone through this. So I think one example we can learn from is Thailand from during the Asian financial crisis. So if you look at like a lot of the policies, they were also in this very similar situation where there was excessive money printing, there was high levels of inflation that was going on, and so I think one thing they had to do, to get out of this crisis, one is that they had to go for a more floating exchange rate, to a more managed floating exchange rate, which we have now done to a certain extent. But also we need to continue to tighten on that monetary policy. So we should not be going for any excessive money printing, maybe if required to even tighten the interest rates further. So that's one thing that we need to do. The other thing we also need to be mindful of is to properly, because one area where the crisis can potentially worsen is if the economic crisis also leads to a financial crisis, or a crisis in the banking system. So that is something that is also a worry right now, because I think I think last week at the Advocata, the conference as well, I think the president had said, I think they were looking at potentially currently we are negotiating with our foreign debt that we need to restructure that. But potentially we might also be looking at a situation where some of the domestic debt might also be restructured. And a lot of that domestic debt is also held by commercial banks as well as like the EPF. So, so there are worries that those kind of steps can also lead to pressure on the banking system. So I think that would be a critical thing that the central bank needs to look into, that they manage the situation so that if there's any banks or finance companies that are in distress, that they provide that appropriate support, to prevent it from snowballing into something bigger. So that is one thing. And I think the other aspect, of course, is to use this opportunity, in order to recover from that. If you are looking at like a 2-year recovery timetable, one thing that you need to definitely do is you need to enact some of those reforms, because we have now defaulted on our debt, we will now be going for a debt restructuring package. And under that, typically what happens is that for the next 5 years or so, the interest payments are usually waived off. Not waived off, sorry, it's deferred basically for those 5-year period. So that means that gives us the capacity to like build up our reserves again, because it also like removes the burden of the interest payments. Because if you look in Sri Lanka, at like the latest numbers, most of the tax revenue, I mean, close to like 70-80% or more is like going to funding those interest payments. So there's very little capacity to like spend on anything else. So by removing that, that gives us the government some breathing space for them to do some of those reforms, to make some of those budget cuts, and to do some of those reforms to the public sector and state-owned enterprises that can overall help to reduce the debt burden of the government. So that's what Thailand also did. They enacted these budget cuts, as well as quite likely we will have to go for like tax increases. So those are the things, as well as get more private sector involvement, because right now one thing that is also being discussed is the state-owned enterprises. Some of them the government might be looking to privatize them, because they are also a factor that is adding to a lot of the government debt. So though, getting the private sector more involved, and maybe even that's also like an opportunity to attract like foreign investment. So those are some of the things that they might be looking at.
Okay, moving on to the next question. How do you think privatization, digitalization, and making the country a business hub will support the government to overcome this situation? What is your view on implementing such strategies?
Yeah, so in terms of the privatization, like I said, I think definitely with some of the state-owned enterprises, I think particularly areas which could be, there is like no reason, for no economic reason for the state to be involved, or those economic reasons don't really make sense. You should let the private sector sort of like handle that. And so I think one immediate benefit of that, it takes it off the hands of the government, those debt burdens and things like that. Um, it's not going to add further to the government's debt burden, while also potentially you can improve that efficiency of those institutions. So definitely privatization is something that they should be looking at, uh, and the other area is with the digitization. So that's another area where you can really bring in a lot of efficiencies and cost savings. Because right now we have seen, since the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of like work from home, as well as recently with the fuel prices as well. Those changes have happened, and the changes have happened not just in the private sector, it's also happened in the public sector, where they have moved to this more flexible work arrangements, etc. So that is something, so that has also been, that those changes have been facilitated because of the digitization. By digitizing more of the processes, you can bring in those efficiency improvements, which also results in cost savings. So you've already seen a lot of that happening in like certain industries. I think particularly with the banking industry, you're seeing that a lot of things have now been digitized compared to what it was earlier. So now, things that you would normally go to the bank to get done, you can now, just do it through, through the website or through their app. So similar efficiencies can be brought to their own like different segments. So I think digitization is definitely something that can look at, and looking at even case studies from other countries. A lot of these relatively small countries are the ones that have benefited a lot from this digitization. So I think a couple of examples are, I think, in a lot of Eastern European countries, I think like Estonia and I think a few others, similar sort of countries, they have used these, digitization has been effective in being able to deliver those services to the public, while also like keeping their costs low. So yeah, definitely the digitization is something that they need to look at. Then I think the third aspect you want, I think you said, is on that business, making a country becoming a business hub. So really, when it comes to business, if you are like to attract like foreign investors to come and set up here, it's not really, their focus is not really on what are the tax holidays or the tax benefits they can get by coming here. Really, what they're looking for is, are the resources there in the country, in terms of the human capital or the, the natural resource or whatever, depending on the industry, as well as that ease of doing business. So I think, in Sri Lanka's case, when it comes to certain sectors, particularly in the tech sector, the ICT sector, then areas like these KPO and BPO type of operations relating to like finance, accounting, like law firms. Sri Lanka has that, that human capital is there. We have that capability and that talent for those kind of industries. But what is lacking is that business friendly environment. Because right now, to like to like start a business, there's like so many procedures that you need to go through. It takes a long time for any of those to happen. So because the ease of doing business is quite low, and that shows in like those various rankings that are there, and Sri Lanka is quite doesn't do so well on those. So that's an area that you can really improve on to improve that, the business, the business friendliness. And I think one change they are doing right now, I think it's been something that has been discussed for a long time, but I think finally they have, like, I think the cabinet has now given approval for that, is that what they call the single window for businesses. So that is, you have like a one-stop shop to get all the approvals you need, all the get all the facilities that you need to start and run the business. So those are some of the positive measures that can take to improve that, the business friendliness.
Okay, and the last question for the day will be, what strategies can the country implement to overcome the economic situation, to reduce inflation, and help people obtain their basic needs without any struggle?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a challenging situation right now, and I think particularly with regard to the inflation, it's really, I mean, it's affecting like all aspects of the economy, and all households are pretty much affected to different extents. But I think one is, of course, one measure we would need to see is to we want to implement is like those who are like most vulnerable, the households that are most affected by this. We need to while there is pressure, while the government does need to like cut back on its expenditure and try to save, they also need to be mindful of the impact it's having uh, on the households who are really struggling. So you really need to, on that side, you need to really expand some of the targeted relief measures that you might be having to these households that are particularly vulnerable. So you need to identify and have these targeted measures to help them. At the same time, we can also like try to appeal internationally as well, because this is not just like a local crisis. Like globally, there is high inflation and this kind of situation is there. So we can appeal to, like, if we can sort of show that we are genuine in terms of like the reform measures that we want to take, investors, and even to use like the Sri Lankan diaspora, we can attract those support that we would need in this crisis situation. And other measures, I mean, like other measures the government might consider, which is not really, which is shown to be not very effective, is like going for price controls and things like that. In the short term it might help, but it's usually not a very sustainable measure, because usually what happens is, if you go for some sort of price control measure, and there is a big gap between the control prices and what you see, and we kind of saw that happening during the fuel, the fuel shortages as well. Like a whole like black market had sort of like developed around that. So when in this situation where you have these price controls, it can also lead to these artificial shortages. That's not an ideal situation. So yeah, so it's a bit of a tricky situation. And I would say the most important thing is you to continue with this IMF program and doing these reform measures, because then that would also then give the confidence to the investors to look at the country more favorably, and that should help stabilize things as well. So yeah, I would say continue with these reforms. Make sure that you speedily go through these the IMF negotiations and negotiations with the creditors, but at the same time be mindful of having some relief measures to support the households that are most vulnerable by this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Travis, for your valuable insights. I'm sure it will support us a lot. And once again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and joining with us today. Hope you have a nice day. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries here too. And yeah, all the best with your
Thank you.